The air catches. It happens the moment his voice cuts through the drone of polite conversation, through the clinking of glasses, through the carefully constructed illusion of warmth. It's my Uncle Robert, standing near the barbecue smoke, a casual cruelty in his eyes that's been honed over decades. He smiles, but the smile doesn't reach the judgment that lives permanently around his mouth. He's talking about me, ostensibly to Cousin Sarah, but loud enough for half the patio to hear. The words themselves are new. They've been whispered, implied, felt in the subtle shift of weight when I enter a room my whole life. But hearing them, spoken aloud, with that particular blend of pity and disdain, hits differently here, now, surrounded by faces I'm supposed to belong to. Bless their heart, he says, shaking his head slowly, performing for his small audience. Tried their hand at, well, everything, didn't they? Never could quite find their footing, could they? Some people, I suppose, are just destined to be the black sheep. The words hang in the air like the sweet, thick smell of grilling meat, but they are sour. They wrap around me, tighter than any sweater, and the heat of the July afternoon feels suddenly cold. My own heart, a moment ago beating with the nervous rhythm of forced family cheer, stutters. It feels exposed, raw. This isn't just a casual comment. This is a pronouncement, a public declaration of where I stand in the family hierarchy, etched in judgment and delivered with a smile. If this story hits close to home, the feeling of being labeled misunderstood, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps bring more of these stories to life. Stories about finding your place when the world, or even your own family, tries to tell you that you don't have one. Before the heat of that moment, before the words black sheep were weaponized on a suburban patio, life was quieter. A steady hum of trying. I lived in a small apartment that smelled faintly of old books and instant coffee. My days weren't marked by the structured ascent my cousins boasted about, the promotions, the corner offices, the perfectly manicured lawns. Mine were spent hunched over a screen, building something fragile and unseen, something that felt important to me, even if it didn't translate into a recognizable career path or a steady stream of income that impressed anyone at Thanksgiving. My ambition wasn't a ladder. It was a winding path through a forest I barely understood. I chased ideas, not titles. I valued freedom and creation over security and status. This, in my family's eyes, was not just unconventional. It was a failure. They were engineers, doctors, lawyers, accountants. Pillars of the community, built on solid ground. I was a dreamer, an artist, they'd say with a sigh, like it was a chronic illness. I cobbled together a living, freelance gigs, odd jobs, selling things online. It was enough to pay rent, buy food, and keep my fragile dream alive. It wasn't enough to silence the questions, the helpful suggestions that I get a real job, settle down, stop wasting my potential. The truth was, their disapproval stung more than I ever let on. You crave acceptance from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, that their definition of success isn't yours, but a part of you aches for their nod, their genuine smile, their pride. Instead, I got the head tilts, the concerned frowns, the stories about how well my cousins were doing. Always compared, always found wanting. The label wasn't new, but its weight grew heavier with each passing year, each unconventional choice, each perceived stumble. The invitation arrived in the mail, thick cardstock, embossed lettering. The annual family reunion. My gut reaction was a familiar clench of anxiety. The forced smiles, the awkward questions, the feeling of being under a microscope. Every year was a performance I wasn't good at, a play where I didn't know the lines everyone else seemed to have memorized. It felt safer to decline, to invent a sudden illness or a work emergency. Easier to be the absent black sheep than the present one, a living, breathing reminder of their disappointment. But something shifted inside me this year. Maybe it was the quiet progress I was making on my own terms, the tiny victories nobody in my family knew about. Maybe it was simple exhaustion, a weariness of hiding, of feeling like I had to apologize for existing outside their box. A stubbornness set in. Why should I exile myself? Why should I let their judgment dictate whether or not I could see the people I did care about, the few cousins or aunts who offered quiet kindness instead of critique? I RSVP'd yes. The decision felt small, but significant. It was a quiet defiance. I wouldn't pretend to be someone I wasn't, wouldn't dress in clothes that felt foreign, wouldn't fabricate a life that fit their narrative. I would just
go
and see what happened. The anxiety was still there, a low thrum beneath my skin, but it was overlaid with a thin layer of resolve. I told myself I could handle it. I had faced worse. Their words were just words, after all. They couldn't physically hurt me. The drive to the reunion felt long, the landscape blurring into a montage of trees and sky. My hands were tight on the steering wheel. As I pulled up to my aunt and uncle's sprawling house, the familiar cars lining the street sent a fresh wave of nerves through me. There they were, the sedans, the SUVs, the vehicles of people with stable lives and predictable futures. Mine felt small and slightly dusty by comparison. Stepping out of the car was like stepping onto a stage where I knew I hadn't been cast in a leading role. The noise of the reunion hit me first. Laughter, chatter, the clatter of plates. Then the faces. Some lit up with genuine warmth, a few with polite surprise, many with that familiar, hard-to-read neutrality that felt like reserved judgment. The initial greetings were a minefield. "Oh, you made it," said with varying degrees of emphasis. "Still, doing your thing?" asked with a patronizing tilt of the head. "Any big news?" which wasn't a question about my life, but an invitation for me to confess I had none that measured up. I navigated the early hours with a practiced smile and noncommittal answers. I complimented the food, admired the garden, played briefly with the younger kids who didn't yet understand the family hierarchy. But the undercurrent was always there. Conversations would pause slightly when I joined a group. Someone would inevitably bring up Cousin David's latest promotion or Cousin Emily's new house, their eyes flicking towards me as if to highlight the contrast. I felt the familiar weight of being the anomaly, the one who didn't fit the mold, the one who hadn't lived up to unspoken expectations. It was less overt hostility and more constant low-grade pressure, like being in a room with slightly too little oxygen. Every breath felt like an effort. I tried to remind myself why I came, clinging to that quiet resolve. As the afternoon wore on, the polite veneer began to crack, at least from certain quarters. The alcohol flowed, loosening tongues and eroding inhibitions. My Uncle Robert, in particular, seemed to gain confidence with every glass of wine. He was the self-appointed patriarch, the keeper of the family's values and judgments. He'd always been the most vocal about his concerns for my future. Now, fueled by entitlement and Cabernet, his comment sharpened. He cornered me by the grill, ostensibly asking about my work. "Still doing websites, is it?" he asked, the word websites laced with condescension, as if I were still building GeoCities pages in 1998. I explained as patiently as I could the complexity of what I did, the blend of technology and creativity. He just nodded slowly, his gaze drifting over my shoulder to where my cousin, a successful lawyer, was holding court. "It's good you have hobbies," he said eventually, clapping me on the shoulder a little too hard. "But a person needs something solid, you know?" A foundation. It wasn't advice, it was a dismissal. A not-so-subtle reminder that my foundation, in his eyes, was built on sand. Later, he regaled a group with stories of his own early career struggles, framing them as quaint hurdles on the inevitable path to success. The unspoken comparison hung heavy in the air. He struggled, but triumphed. I, on the other hand, seemed determined to struggle indefinitely. Every story was a parable about the value of hard work, discipline, and choosing a sensible path. Each anecdote was a thinly veiled critique of my life choices. It wasn't just annoying, it was emotionally draining. It felt like being pecked to death by a bird that insisted it was only trying to help you fly correctly. The passive aggression escalated into something more direct, fueled by the setting sun and the emptying wine bottles. I found myself standing near the patio doors, trying to blend into the background, hoping to escape notice. But Uncle Robert wasn't finished. He had an audience now, a small circle of family members who were either genuinely listening or too polite to walk away. He started talking about family legacy, about carrying on traditions, about making the family name proud. His eyes found me across the patio. And that's when he delivered the line, the one that stopped the air, the one that solidified everything felt into a single, sharp phrase. "Bless their heart," he said, that performative sigh accompanying his words. "Tried their hand at, well, everything, didn't they? Never could quite find their footing, could they? Some people, I suppose, are just destined to be the black sheep." The words landed with the weight of a physical blow. My breath hitched. The casual cruelty, the public declaration of my failure, the way he said black sheep like a diagnosis, it was all designed to wound, to put me firmly in my place. The smiles around him faltered for a second, some looking away, some offering fleeting, awkward pity. Nobody contradicted him. The silence that followed felt louder than any shouting match could have been. It was the silence of agreement, or, at least, the silence of complicity. In that moment, surrounded by faces that suddenly felt alien and cold, the carefully constructed wall I had built around my feelings crumbled. The years of trying, the quiet struggle, the dismissal, it all condensed into a burning ball in my chest. I felt humiliation, yes, but beneath that, something else. A profound, aching loneliness. This was my family, and they saw me as a disappointment, an outlier, a problem. Everything seemed lost. All my perceived failures were laid bare, confirmed by the self-appointed family elder. The patio, moments ago a scene of forced festivity, felt like an arena where I had just been publicly shamed. I wanted to disappear, to teleport anywhere else. The smell of barbecue suddenly nauseated me. The laughter felt like mockery. I was the black sheep, branded and isolated, under the uncaring sun. The immediate aftermath of Uncle Robert's pronouncement was a blur of awkwardness. A few people mumbled things like, "Oh, Robert," but there was no real defense, no challenge. Someone tried to change the subject, too quickly. I felt like an exhibit, the topic of conversation, but not a participant. My smile felt brittle, ready to shatter. I wanted to run, to hide, to curl up until the feeling passed. The air still tasted of his words. I retreated, finding a quiet corner near the back fence, pretending to be engrossed in my phone. But I wasn't reading anything. My mind was replaying his words, his smug expression, the silence of the others. Black sheep. The label felt heavier than ever before. It wasn't just his opinion. It felt like the family consensus, finally articulated without filter. It stung because it hit on my deepest insecurity, that despite my efforts, my unconventional path was seen not just as different, but as inherently less valuable, less worthy. All the quiet progress, the small victories I cherished, felt meaningless in the face of this public judgment. Everything I had worked for, everything I believed in, seemed diminished to a mere hobby. The crisis was deep. My sense of belonging, always tenuous, felt irrevocably severed. I was outside looking in, even though I was physically present. Sitting there, nursing a glass of water I didn't want, watching my family interact, a profound sadness washed over me. This is what it was. This was my place. The outsider, the topic of hushed conversations and pitying glances. The black sheep. It felt final, crushing. But then, slowly, something else began to surface from beneath the layers of hurt and humiliation. Anger. Not a hot, explosive rage, but a cold, steady burn. Anger at his cruelty, at their passive acceptance, at the narrowness of their vision. And beneath the anger, a tiny spark of defiance. Why was I letting this define me? Why was I letting their definition of success dictate my worth? Their world was small, predictable, safe. Mine was larger, messier, and infinitely more exciting, even with its uncertainties. I had chosen a different path for a reason. Because it felt authentic. Because it allowed me to create, to explore, to build something that mattered to me. Their judgment was a reflection of their fears, their limitations, not mine. Sitting there, breathing in the evening air that was finally cooling, a fierce resolve solidified. This wouldn't be the story of the black sheep who finally broke under the pressure. This would be the story of the black sheep who found their own pasture, greener and wilder than anything the flock could imagine. I wasn't going to spend my life seeking their approval, shrinking myself to fit their mold. I would stand tall in my own space. And then, a different kind of tension began to build in my gut, replacing the knot of anxiety. A quiet anticipation. Something else was happening, something I had been told might happen today, something that existed completely outside their world, outside their judgment. An announcement. A national award. I had been shortlisted months ago, gone through interviews, submitted portfolios. It was for the project I had poured my heart and soul into, the one they didn't understand, the one that felt like a hobby to Uncle Robert. I had received a cryptic email just yesterday, hinting that the results would be announced live today, during a specific broadcast. I hadn't told anyone in the family. Why bother? They wouldn't get it, or they'd find a way to diminish it. But sitting there, feeling the sting of black sheep, the timing felt suddenly, impossibly, significant. It wasn't about proving them wrong, not entirely. It was about claiming my own truth, my own validation, in a way that transcended their limited perspective. I looked at my phone again. The time was approaching. The broadcast would be starting soon. A new determination settled over me, cold and sharp. I wouldn't leave. I would stay. And I would face whatever came next, not as the black sheep, but as myself. The moment was shifting. The passive enduring was over. The turning point had arrived. As evening drew in, people started migrating inside, seeking refuge from the mosquitoes that had found their rhythm. The television was on in the living room, tuned low to a national news channel. People drifted in and out, chatting, grabbing drinks, the hum of conversation filling the large room. I found a seat slightly apart from the main clusters, close enough to see the screen, far enough to maintain a semblance of personal space. The uncle, having moved on from dissecting my life, was now holding forth on politics, equally confident and dismissive. The air was thick with the smell of food, perfume, and the underlying tension of too many people with too much history in one place. The news program shifted. A segment began, introduced with fanfare. It was an award ceremony, one recognizing innovation and achievement in various fields. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was it. The project, the one that felt like a secret life, had led to this. The categories were announced, one by one. Faces flashed on the screen, names of accomplished individuals celebrated for their contributions. The family around me paid little attention, occasionally glancing up if a field they recognized was mentioned. They were still in their reunion bubble, their minds on property values and school districts and the never-ending saga of who said what to whom. Then came the category relevant to my work. The announcer's voice filled the room, clear and resonant. The nominees were listed, their photos appearing on screen. My own photo was there, a small square among others. My breath caught. No one in the room noticed. They were talking, laughing, oblivious. Uncle Robert was mid-sentence, gesturing emphatically about tax policy. The tension in my chest tightened to an almost unbearable point. It felt surreal, this juxtaposition. My small, ignored reality unfolding on a national stage while the very people who dismissed me talked about their mundane concerns mere feet away. The announcer paused. The drumroll sound effect from the TV filled the slight lull in family conversation. And the recipient of this year's national award for the announcer's voice built to a crescendo. My hands were clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. This was it. Years of quiet work, of believing in something nobody else seemed to understand, of enduring the dismissiveness. It all came down to this one moment. The announcer's smile widened. My name. Spoken aloud, not by a condescending uncle, but by a voice on national television, followed by applause from an unseen audience. The room went silent. Utterly, completely silent. Every single head snapped towards the television screen. My photo was large now, filling the screen behind the announcer. My name was printed beneath it in bold letters. The description of my project followed, the words echoing through the sudden, stunned quiet. The plot twist wasn't just the announcement. It was the timing, the setting, the audience. It was the complete and utter blindsiding of the people who had just minutes ago confirmed my status as the family failure. I looked, not at the screen, but at their faces. Uncle Robert's face was a mask of absolute, unadulterated shock. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide and fixed on the screen. The confidence, the smugness, the condescension, it was all wiped away, replaced by disbelief. He looked like he'd been slapped. He stammered, the political point he was making completely forgotten. My name? On TV. A wave of gasps went through the room. My cousins, the successful ones, stared. Their spouses, who had always managed a polite distance, looked flabbergasted. Aunts and uncles who had offered pitying smiles now wore expressions of stunned confusion. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. The only sound was the announcer on the television, now detailing the significance of the award, the impact of the project. It was surreal. My life, the one they had labeled insignificant, was being celebrated on a national platform, live, in their living room. I didn't stand up. I didn't cheer. I didn't say, "I told you so." The vindication wasn't loud. It was quiet, settling deep in my bones. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore, not really. It was about the universe, perhaps, offering a cosmic punchline. The black sheep, the one who couldn't find their footing, had just been recognized for walking a path entirely their own, a path that led to a place none of them could have imagined. The award wasn't just a piece of validation. It was a spotlight shone directly onto the contrast between their judgment and my reality. It was winning bigger, not just succeeding, but succeeding in a way that completely undermined their narrative about me. They hadn't just been wrong. They had been spectacularly, publicly wrong, and I hadn't even lifted a finger to make it happen. The silence eventually broke, but it was replaced by a different kind of noise, a rush of awkward, disbelieving murmurs. People started talking at once, voices hushed but frantic. Is that my name? The award. National? Uncle Robert was the first to recover, though his recovery was shaky. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he boomed, trying to recapture his earlier bluster. "Well, I'll be. Didn't know you were up for anything like that. Wonderful news. Truly wonderful." He tried to catch my eye, to offer some semblance of patriarch-level congratulations, but his face was still pale, the shock clinging to him. Others followed suit, a chorus of surprised congratulations. "Oh, my name, that's amazing. We had no idea." The questions weren't condescending anymore. They were bewildered, slightly panicked. They wanted to understand how the black sheep had suddenly turned into this. I accepted their congratulations quietly. My voice felt steady, calm. I didn't offer lengthy explanations. I didn't dwell on the details of the award or the project. Their sudden interest felt performative, a scramble to adapt to a narrative they hadn't written. There was no triumphant speech from me, no gloating. The moment itself was the victory. Their faces, Uncle Robert's in particular, were the only confirmation I needed. They were blindsided, their world momentarily tilted off its axis. The rest of the evening was surreal. The atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The black sheep was suddenly something else. People who had ignored me earlier now sought me out, asking hesitant questions about my work. The conversations felt forced, artificial. Uncle Robert avoided my gaze, occasionally glancing at me as if trying to reconcile the person he had dismissed with the person who had just appeared on his television screen. The emotional closure wasn't a grand moment of reconciliation or a declaration of independence. It was quieter than that. It was the realization that I didn't need their approval anymore. Not after this. Their judgment had lost its power. It had been exposed as narrow, outdated, and irrelevant to the path I was actually walking. The The bitterness lingered, a faint aftertaste, but it was no longer defining. The national award was wonderful, a significant milestone, but the real prize was the internal shift. I had faced their judgment, endured the deep crisis of feeling completely alienated, and emerged not victorious over them, but simply victorious as myself. Leaving the reunion, that night felt different from any previous year. There was no lingering ache of inadequacy, no replay of condescending comments. There was a quiet sense of peace, a lightness I hadn't expected. The black sheep had found their own flock, one built on passion and purpose, not on conforming to outdated expectations. The lesson learned was sharp and clear. True validation comes from within, and from the work itself. External approval, especially from those who haven't bothered to understand you, is ultimately irrelevant. My path was mine, validated not by a family reunion, but by the quiet, persistent pursuit of something I believed in. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe offers a perfectly timed moment of poetic justice, a quiet, elegant counterpoint to years of being misunderstood. The road ahead was still uncertain, still mine to forge, but I was walking it now with a different kind of certainty, a quiet confidence that didn't need anyone else's permission or understanding. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the outsider, the one walking a different path, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these stories to life.